They say every man's home is his castle. Well, mine just happened to have a garage that nearly sent a few people straight into a panic attack. It was a Tuesday morning when I heard the screech of cheap boots against my driveway. Through the blinds, I watched them march in a pair of self-declared HOA cops, wearing discount uniforms, toy badges shining like they'd been bought off eBay. They didn't knock. They didn't even hesitate. They smashed my lock open and stormed into my garage, like they were raiding a cartel warehouse. What they expected to find? Maybe contraband, maybe something they could hold over me, to finally make me bow to their ridiculous rules. But what they actually saw froze them solid. Their faces went pale, mouths dropped open, and the bravado drained right out of them. Because staring back at them, laid out neatly on the workbench and walls, were rows of authentic FBI credentials, badges, and tactical gear. And in that moment, those HOA clowns realized they hadn't just broken into a garage. They had just walked straight into federal territory. My name's Daniel Reed. I'm 51 years old, which I guess puts me squarely in that bracket where neighbors start assuming you either know everything or nothing at all. Truth is, I prefer keeping people guessing. For most of my adult life, I worked in places and on missions where discretion wasn't just encouraged, it was survival. I spent 2 decades as a federal agent. These days I call myself retired, though that word feels more like a costume I wear than a reality. Let's just say I traded classified files and cross-country stings for power tools and fishing rods. When my wife Marlene and I found this neighborhood, quiet streets, manicured lawns, a view of the hills that turned gold at sunset, it seemed like the perfect place to build a slower life. I wasn't looking for drama, and I definitely wasn't looking to wave my past around like a flag. I just wanted peace. A little slice of suburbia where my grown kids could visit, where the sound of a lawnmower meant weekend chores and not surveillance cover noise. Now, I know what you're thinking. Suburbs always come with one catch. And you'd be right. The catch here came in 3 bold letters painted on the welcome sign at the entrance HOA, the Homeowners Association. A phrase I'd never paid much attention to before moving in. How bad could a handful of neighbors with clipboards really be? I thought it was about keeping the streets tidy, making sure houses didn't fall into disrepair, and ensuring people picked up after their dogs. Reasonable enough, right? Wrong. From the moment we unpacked our boxes, there was her. Every neighborhood has one, the self-appointed queen of order. In our case, her name was Karen Holt, and she wore her title of HOA president like it was a badge of honor. Or in her case, a scepter she used to jab at anyone who dared step out of line. Karen was in her late 50s with a hairstyle that looked like it had been sprayed into battle formation and a voice that could cut glass. She didn't so much introduce herself as she did announce her presence. Our very first interaction wasn't "welcome to the neighborhood, but your trash can lid isn't regulation." I thought she was joking. She wasn't. It didn't take long before the notes started showing up. Little yellow slips on my door. Warnings about grass height and mailbox color coordination. Apparently my black mailbox was too glossy compared to the others on the street. Once she even left a citation because a leaf blower had been leaning against my garage door for more than 30 minutes. Now, I'm not a man who angers easily. Years of working with criminals, liars, and politicians had taught me the value of patience. But there's something uniquely irritating about being told by a neighbor, one who doesn't pay your mortgage, mind you, that your flower beds aren't symmetrical enough. At first I brushed it off. My wife would shake her head, laugh, and remind me, "She's just bored, Danny. Don't give her the satisfaction." So I didn't. I smiled, nodded, and tossed the notes into a drawer. I started calling the Karen file. Thing is, the more you ignore people like that, the louder they get. Karen wasn't satisfied with controlling her own yard. She wanted the entire neighborhood bowing to her every decree. And while some folks gave in painting, shutters, replanting grass, even changing the curtains visible from the street, I wasn't wired that way. My life had been built on standing firm when pushed on, knowing when to hold my ground and when to move. And this was just a woman with too much free time and a stack of printer paper. At least that's what I thought in the beginning. The funny part is my garage had always been a sore spot for her. She couldn't see inside, and that drove her crazy. Every other house had windows or left their garage doors cracked open at times. Mine locked, curtains drawn, private. And for someone like Karen, privacy was suspicious. I knew she gossiped about it during HOA meetings. Neighbors would casually mention, "Karen's been saying you've got a whole operation in there." I'd laugh it off because in a way she was right. My garage was an operation, just not the kind she imagined. See, when you've spent years working cases that span states and required fast deployment, you get used to being prepared. My garage wasn't cluttered with junk. It was organized, precise. Labeled shelves, locked cabinets, and yes, boxes delivered from old colleagues containing items I legally owned but hadn't exactly advertised. Tactical gear, files I'd been cleared to keep for training purposes. And of course the badges. Not toys, not replicas. Real, official. My career laid out in metal and leather. I never flaunted it. Why would I? I wasn't trying to scare anyone. But to a nosy neighbor desperate for power, the unknown is the most terrifying thing of all. And to Karen, that garage was like Pandora's box. Every time I waved politely from the driveway, I could see her eyes flick behind me, searching for a glimpse of what was inside. Every package that arrived at my doorstep, whether it was tools, fishing equipment, or a book order, was fuel for her conspiracy theories. At neighborhood barbecues, she'd toss barbs my way. "What exactly do you do in there all day, Daniel?" she'd ask, smile tight as barbed wire. I'd sip my beer and answer, just keeping busy. Nothing irritated her more than not having a straight answer she could twist. But here's the truth. I didn't tell anyone back then. I wasn't keeping secrets for the thrill of it. I was keeping them because I knew what happened when the wrong people got too close. And in this neighborhood, the wrong people were already circling. Because Karen wasn't alone. She had her board 3 or 4 others who seemed to think being part of the HOA made them deputies in some suburban sheriff's office. Together they strutted around with clipboards and smug expressions, knocking on doors, taking photos of people's yards, whispering threats about fines. Most folks either complied or grumbled quietly. Me, I became their favorite target. And so what began as a battle over grass length slowly brewed into something much bigger. Something ridiculous, yes, but also dangerous in its own small-town way. Because when people drunk on power decide to play cop, they don't care who they trample to prove their authority. And as it turned out, they had chosen the wrong garage to mess with. Let us know where you're watching from today, and if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community. It started as these things always do with a piece of paper. One morning I stepped outside to grab the paper and found a bright red envelope taped to my front door. Not slipped neatly into the mailbox like normal mail. Oh no, Karen wanted this one to scream. Bold block letters across the front read, "Notice of suspicious activity." I laughed out loud. Suspicious activity. At my age, the most suspicious thing I usually did before noon was brew a second pot of coffee. But curiosity got the better of me, so I tore it open. Inside was a letter typed in a font that looked like it came straight from a 1992 crime drama. It accused me of storing potentially hazardous and unauthorized materials in my garage. It also stated that multiple neighbors had reported unusual deliveries and strange equipment noises coming from my property. I read it twice, then a third time, because the absurdity was almost too much to process. Deliveries. Sure, I ordered tools, books, the occasional fishing rod. Equipment noises. Well, sometimes I worked on woodworking projects or tuned up my old motorcycle. Hazardous materials. Unless you counted motor oil and a few cans of WD-40, my garage was cleaner than most kitchens. The letter was signed at the bottom, Karen Holt, HOA President. I folded it carefully, slipped it into my growing Karen file, and went inside chuckling. But as the day wore on, the humor faded. Because this wasn't just another note about lawn height or mailbox gloss. This was something different. She wasn't citing me for a rule violation, she was accusing me of criminal behavior. The next day, I noticed Karen and her little entourage standing on the sidewalk across from my driveway, clipboards in hand, whispering and pointing. Every time a delivery truck pulled up, I'd see her jotting something down like she was building a case. One afternoon, when I carried in a large package containing nothing more than a set of power drills, I swear I heard her mutter, "That's it. I knew it. It was laughable, sure." But there was also something chilling about the way she fixated on me. A week later, the rumors started. A neighbor I'd spoken to maybe twice in my life approached me at the grocery store, his tone careful. "Hey, Daniel, everything okay at your place? Folks are saying you're, storing chemicals." I almost dropped the carton of milk in my hand. Chemicals. Was that the latest story? I managed to smile. Unless you count beer and fertilizer, I think we're safe. But inside, I was fuming. Not because I cared what this guy thought I didn't, but because I knew exactly where those whispers had started. Karen wasn't just pestering me anymore. She was actively trying to poison the well. Later that week, I caught her board members standing at the edge of my property line, snapping photos of my garage door from different angles. One even crouched down like he was a crime scene photographer. I stepped outside, leaned on the railing, and called out, "Make sure you get my good side." They scurried off, red-faced, but the damage was done. Whatever case Karen was building, she was determined to see it through. The final straw came one Saturday morning. I was in the garage working on a cabinet project, the door cracked open to let in some fresh air. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Two men, both mid-42nd, dressed in matching navy polos with the words HOA security stitched onto the chest. They wore shiny belts with cheap flashlights clipped on, and one even had a radio dangling like he was Secret Service. I recognized them instantly, Karen's new recruits. They strutted right up the driveway and stopped at the garage door. "Sir," one of them barked, puffing out his chest, "we've had multiple reports of illegal storage in this garage. We're going to need to conduct an inspection." I set down my hammer, slowly wiping my hands on a rag, and gave them a long look. They didn't even blink, like they were convinced they had real authority. "An inspection?" I asked, tone calm but edged with sarcasm. "Do you gentlemen have a warrant for that?" They glanced at each other, clearly not expecting pushback. The taller one cleared his throat. "We have authorization from the HOA board. That gives us the right to—" I cut him off with a laugh so sharp it echoed off the garage walls. "The HOA doesn't issue warrants, boys. You knock on my door again with this nonsense, and you're the ones breaking the law." Their faces tightened, but they backed down. For the moment. That night I told Marlene about it over dinner. She set down her fork and gave me a look that was half worry, half exasperation. "Danny, this isn't normal. They're not just being nosy anymore, they're escalating. What if they actually try to force their way in?" I reached across the table, squeezed her hand. "Then they'll get a surprise they never saw coming." The truth was, I had already started to sense where this was heading. Karen wasn't going to stop at letters or gossip. She was obsessed, and obsessed people make reckless moves. But instead of fear, I felt a strange calm, because while she thought she was closing in on me, she had no idea she was walking right into my world, the one where rules actually matter, and authority isn't something you can buy with HOA dues. And if she wanted to play cops and robbers, well, she was about to learn the difference between plastic badges and the real thing. By the time spring rolled around, Karen and her self-declared HOA cops had turned their obsession into a full-blown crusade. It started small. More letters, more threats, more neighbors giving me that sideways glance like I was cooking meth in the garage instead of sanding down a cabinet. But as the weeks dragged on, the harassment grew bolder. One Tuesday morning, I came home from running errands to find a bright orange sticker plastered across my garage door. In block letters, it read, "Condemned. Unsafe structure." I stood there, staring at it, grocery bags digging into my hands, until I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the eggs. Condemned. My garage was built sturdier than most of the houses on this street. When I peeled the sticker off, I noticed something even better. The official seal printed on the bottom wasn't from the county. It was the HOA's crest, the same silly logo they used on their newsletters, complete with a little oak tree, and the motto, "Keeping our community safe." Safe. That word carried about as much weight in their mouths as law enforcement. I didn't even bother confronting Karen that day. I knew exactly what game she was playing, and it was only a matter of time before she doubled down. And double down she did. The next week I was woken at 6 a.m. by the sound of knocking, no pounding, on my front door. I opened it to find two of her enforcers, standing there in their navy polos, this time with shiny gold star badges pinned to their chests. From 10 feet away, they almost looked convincing. Up close, though, I recognized them for what they were: cheap novelty badges you could buy at a costume shop. "Mr. Reed," one of them announced, his tone stiff with rehearsed authority, "we have reason to believe your garage contains hazardous materials. We're here to conduct a safety inspection on behalf of the HOA." I leaned against the door frame, rubbing the sleep out of my eyes. "Safety inspection, huh? Got paperwork for that?" They hesitated. One muttered, "The board authorized it." "Then bring the board with you." I shot back and slammed the door shut. I heard them grumbling on the porch for a while, radios crackling like props in a school play before they finally trudged off. By now, the whole neighborhood was buzzing. Some folks clearly thought I was guilty of something. Others whispered about how Karen had gone too far, though not loud enough for her to hear. The thing about bullies is they thrive on silence, and Karen was feeding off that silence like gasoline on a fire. 2 days later, my wife called me at work, her voice tight. "Danny, you're not going to believe this. They sent an inspector." "What kind of inspector?" I asked. "A city inspector, but get this, he didn't even have the right paperwork. Said he got an anonymous tip that your property was unsafe." I groaned, already picturing Karen dialing city offices 10 times a day until she found someone gullible enough to humor her. I rushed home only to find the inspector standing awkwardly in the driveway, clipboard in hand, clearly uncomfortable. He admitted quickly that there was no violation, nothing to worry about, and that he'd been pressured into showing up. When he left, Karen was across the street, arms folded, watching like a hawk. That's when it hit me she wasn't going to stop. She wasn't interested in rules or safety. She wanted me gone. Period. And her methods were getting bolder. The fake citations escalated into fines. One envelope demanded I pay $500 for refusing inspection. Another claimed my garage door color was non-compliant with the neighborhood aesthetic, even though it was the same beige as half the houses on the block. I ignored them all, of course. But with every fine I tossed into the Karen file, I knew she was winding herself up tighter. Then came the night incident. It was just past midnight when I heard movement outside. I peeked through the blinds and saw two figures creeping around my property with flashlights. HOA polos again. They tried my side gate locked. They rattled the garage door secure. Then they started snapping photos, whispering to each other like kids daring each other to knock on a haunted house. I stepped quietly onto the porch, cocked the flashlight in my hand, and lit them up like deer in headlights. Smile for the camera, I called out. You're trespassing. They froze, muttered something about official business, and stumbled off into the night. By now, even Marlene was rattled. Danny, this is harassment. What if they actually break in? I pulled her close, my voice steady. Then they'll get exactly what they've been asking for. Because here's the thing, Karen didn't know every time her enforcers showed up, every time they left a fake notice or crossed my property line, I was documenting it. Cameras mounted discreetly, logs written evidence stacked, and every bit of it pointed to one truth: the HOA had slipped from being annoying to being criminal. Still, Karen's confidence only grew. She strutted around at board meetings like she was running a police department, not a suburban committee. Neighbors told me she was bragging about finally catching me. She'd gesture at my house, whispering to new residents that the neighborhood would be safer once I was dealt with. I could see the endgame forming in her mind. She didn't want fines. She didn't want me to comply. She wanted me removed. And she was convinced she had the power to make it happen. One evening, as I watered the lawn, she marched right up to the sidewalk, clipboard in hand. This is your final warning, Mr. Reed. If you refuse inspection, the HOA will take enforcement action. I raised an eyebrow. Enforcement action. What's that writing me? Another scary letter. Her face flushed. We'll do whatever it takes. I gave her a long, steady look. Careful, Karen. Sometimes when you play cop, you end up finding real cops. She didn't understand the weight of my words. Not yet. But she would. Because the storm she was stirring, it wasn't going to drown me, it was going to drown her. The funny thing about people like Karen is that for all their bluster, they're sloppy. They get so drunk on control that they stop worrying about covering their tracks. And for a man who'd spent 20 years in federal investigations, sloppy was my favorite word. I started watching them the same way I used to watch suspects. Not with paranoia, just quiet, methodical attention. It didn't take long to see the cracks. For one thing, her so-called HOA cops weren't subtle. Every time they came skulking around, I had 3 different camera angles recording them: infrared at night, wide angle during the day. My garage had better surveillance than most convenience stores. I kept copies on a hard drive off-site, and secure just in case. The footage was gold. Them trying my locks, one of them fumbling with his badge in the reflection of his car window, even Karen herself scribbling something on her clipboard while standing 2 feet over my property line. It was like watching a parody of Law Enforcement, only these clowns didn't realize the joke was on them. Then there were the complaints. Every letter they sent me was filled with exaggerations and half-truths, but Karen had a bad habit of slipping up. On one notice, she wrote that she had seen me unloading suspicious equipment at midnight. Funny thing was, I was out of town that night visiting my daughter. I had receipts, phone records, even highway toll logs to prove it. Sloppy. But the best break came when I attended one of their HOA meetings, something I usually avoided. I sat in the back quiet, while Karen and her board droned on about shrubbery regulations and paint colors. Then the treasurer gave her report. That's when I noticed the line item security expenses. $3,200. I nearly laughed out loud. $3,000 straight out of HOA dues funneled into what was clearly their fake cop operation. Uniforms, badges, radios, even the ridiculous SUV. They had started parking near the clubhouse with community enforcement decals. Karen was burning through the neighborhood's money to fuel her little fantasy police force. And worse, she wasn't even hiding it well. I leaned over to the neighbor sitting next to me, a guy named Tom who had lived there longer than anyone. What's this security line about? I whispered. He rolled his eyes. Karen says it's for our protection. But I've never seen them protect anything except her ego. That was the moment I knew I had her. Misusing HOA funds. That wasn't just sloppy, that was actionable. Over the next few weeks, I started quietly collecting screenshots of the HOA's financial statements, video evidence of the patrol's trespassing, copies of every bogus fine and citation they'd slapped on my door. I even dug into the HOA bylaws, highlighting every clause they had twisted or outright ignored. The picture that emerged was clear: Karen wasn't running an HOA. She was running a little fiefdom using neighborhood money to play dictator, and all I had to do was let her keep digging her own hole. But here's the thing, once you start gathering evidence, you begin to see patterns you didn't notice before. Like how Karen always had her cops show up right after a big package was delivered to my house. She'd clearly been spying on my deliveries, maybe even bribing the UPS guy for details. Sloppy. Or how her flyers always included quotes from anonymous neighbors, quotes that sounded suspiciously like her own wording. One even had a typo I'd seen her make in an email months earlier. Sloppy. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became, this wasn't about safety or rules. It was personal. She wanted me gone, and she was willing to abuse her authority, her budget, and her goons to make it happen. What she didn't realize was that every step she took made her case weaker, not stronger. One afternoon, I decided to test her. I set a small box on my front porch, just an empty cardboard package with no label. I left it there overnight, right in plain sight of the street. By morning, it was gone. Later that day, I found Karen's newest notice in my mailbox. Unlabeled package, observed suspected hazardous contents. Failure to report may result in fines. She'd taken the bait. My cameras caught her little enforcers snatching the box in the middle of the night, fumbling with it like kids stealing Halloween candy. Sloppy. That was when I knew she was no longer operating in the realm of HOA authority. She was trespassing, tampering with private property, even committing theft. I had her on tape doing all of it. I showed Marlene the footage that evening. She watched in disbelief, shaking her head. "Danny, you've got enough here to bury them." I nodded. "Not yet. They're close to crossing the one line that'll seal their fate. And when they do, I'll be ready." Because here's what Karen didn't understand. I wasn't just some grumpy middle-aged homeowner. I was a man who'd spent 2 decades putting liars, cheats, and bullies in handcuffs. And I knew the value of patience. Let her rant, let her patrol, let her puff herself up with fake authority. Because the more she believed she was winning, the harder she'd fall when the truth came crashing down. And the best part, I wouldn't have to lay a finger on her. She was already building her own case against herself. All I had to do was wait for the break-in I knew was coming, and trust me, it was coming. For weeks, I'd been stacking evidence like bricks in a wall, and Karen had been hammering away at her little war drum. But bullies rarely go quietly. They double down. And sure enough, Karen launched her biggest stunt yet. It started with the flyers. I stepped out one morning to find my face plastered on neon sheets stapled to lampposts all over the neighborhood. Grainy photos of me carrying boxes into my garage were blown up like mugshots with the caption, "Do you know what your neighbor is hiding?" Beneath it in bold red letters she'd written, "Hazardous, illegal, dangerous. Report Daniel Reed to the HOA." I stood there jaw tight, clutching one of the flyers in my hand while neighbors walked by pretending not to stare. It felt surreal, like some twisted wanted poster from the Wild West, except instead of bounty hunters, it was soccer moms and retirees reading it with wide eyes. Marlene was furious when she saw it. "This is slander, Danny. She can't get away with this." I calmed her down, even as my own blood boiled. "She's already hanging herself. Let her keep pulling the rope." But Karen wasn't satisfied with paper propaganda. She wanted a show. That weekend, she called an emergency HOA meeting. I didn't plan on going, frankly. I had better things to do than sit through another one of her tirades, but curiosity got the better of me, and maybe a bit of pride. I wasn't about to let her tell my story without me in the room. The clubhouse was packed. Neighbors filled the folding chairs, whispering, glancing nervously between me and Karen. Up front, she stood behind the podium like a judge in a courtroom, her board members flanking her like bailiffs. She launched into her speech, her voice sharp words, dripping with venom. "We have reason to believe that Mr. Daniel Reed has been engaging in highly suspicious activity. Multiple deliveries at odd hours. No cooperation with inspections. Refusal to comply with HOA safety regulations. Ladies and gentlemen, this man is endangering all of us." She whipped out a stack of photos, those same grainy shots of me hauling in packages. She waved them like evidence in a trial. "What is he hiding? Chemicals, weapons, hazardous waste. We will not tolerate this behavior in our community," the crowd murmured. Some people nodded. Others looked uneasy. I sat there, arms crossed, expression calm, even though every instinct in me wanted to stand and dismantle her case, piece by piece. Instead, I waited. Then she dropped the hammer. "If Mr. Reed continues to obstruct our investigation, we will take enforcement action. Immediate enforcement." Her cops puffed out their chests, nodding like trained seals. It was theater, bad theater, but it worked on some. A woman in the back stood up and shouted, "What if there's a meth lab in there? What if we're breathing poison?" I could see Karen's grin spread. She had the crowd where she wanted them scared. And fear was the currency she thrived on. I walked out before the meeting ended, not because I was defeated, but because I knew exactly what was coming next. And I was right. 2 nights later, I heard it again, the pounding on my door louder this time. I opened it to find Karen's enforcers, standing tall fake badges, gleaming under the porch light. "This is your final notice," one barked. "If you do not allow inspection, we will enter by force." I almost laughed in their faces. "Enter by force? What are you going to do, trip over my welcome mat?" They didn't like that answer. They stormed off radios, crackling with static like a bad police drama. But their threats didn't stop at my door. Flyers multiplied, the gossip spread thicker, and the intimidation ramped up. My mailbox was knocked over twice in a week. Someone spray-painted danger across my driveway in sloppy red letters. Karen was turning the entire neighborhood against me, or at least trying to. Marlene's patience was wearing thin. "This is harassment, Danny. You should call your old contacts, have them arrested." I shook my head. "Not yet. They're going to cross the line themselves. And when they do, I want every second of it on record." And then they finally did. It was a humid Thursday night when I caught them prowling again. This time they weren't just taking pictures. They were carrying bolt cutters. From my office window, I watched them skulk up the driveway, glancing over their shoulders like kids sneaking into a movie. Karen was across the street in her car, watching clipboard balanced on the steering wheel. The taller one gripped the cutter's jaw set and whispered something to his partner. Then snap. The padlock on my side gate clattered to the ground. My cameras caught everything, every movement, every reckless step. I didn't confront them. Not yet. I let them creep around the property, testing doors, rattling windows, whispering about evidence. When they finally slunk away, I exhaled, slow, steady, like a hunter watching prey wander into the open field. Because that was it. The line had been crossed. They weren't just harassing me anymore. They had committed breaking and entering. I tucked the footage away with the rest of my growing mountain of evidence, heart steady. They thought they were tightening the noose around me. But what they didn't realize was that every move they made was tightening it around their own necks. And sooner than they thought, the trap would snap shut. There's a moment right before a storm breaks, when the air goes still. The sky grows heavy, the wind pauses, and you can almost feel the pressure pressing down on your skin. That's how it felt in my house the week after Karen's enforcers snapped that lock on my gate. They thought they'd rattled me. Truth is, I'd never been calmer. Because now, finally, I had exactly what I needed. Proof, evidence, enough to put an end to their little fantasy once and for all. But I wasn't about to rush. No, timing was everything. You don't swat at a hornet's nest until you're ready to burn the whole thing down. So I started preparing. The first step was simple: secure the evidence. I cataloged everything I had, every flyer, every bogus citation, every video clip of their midnight prowls. I saved copies to multiple drives, encrypted them, even mailed a USB stick to my son just in case. Years in the bureau had taught me never to keep all my cards in one place. The second step: reach out to some old friends. I still had contacts, men and women I'd bled beside, worked cases with, trusted with my life. Most had retired like me, but a few were still in the field. I didn't need them to act, not yet. I just needed them to know what was happening. A quick phone call, a short explanation, and the response was exactly what I expected. "Keep the cameras rolling, Danny. When they step inside, call us. We'll handle the rest." That reassurance was a weight off my shoulders. Because while Karen liked to play pretend with her fake cops and plastic badges, I knew what real law looked like, and it was only a phone call away. The third step was, well, a bit of theater. See, I could have called the police right then, could have pressed charges for trespassing, harassment, vandalism, but something in me wanted Karen to feel the full weight of her own arrogance. I wanted her to walk right into the trap, thinking she'd won, only to find the ground vanish beneath her feet. So I set the stage. I made sure my garage was locked, sealed, but not in a way that looked suspicious. I even oiled the hinges so if they forced their way in, the door would open smooth and easy. I rearranged the shelves, laid out the tactical gear, cleaned the FBI badges and IDs until they gleamed under the fluorescent lights. It wasn't about intimidation, it was about clarity. When they broke in, I wanted there to be no doubt about what they were looking at. Authentic, federal-issued gear. Not illegal. Not dangerous. But official. And very, very real. I also adjusted my cameras, one angled directly at the garage interior, another at the driveway, a third capturing the street view, so I'd have Karen herself on film watching the whole thing go down. Meanwhile, I played the part of the oblivious homeowner. I waved to neighbors, trimmed my hedges, carried in more boxes than usual, just to stoke Karen's paranoia. Every move was deliberate, a breadcrumb trail leading her exactly where I wanted her to go. Marlene, bless her, was nervous. Danny, what if they get violent? What if they actually damage the house? I pulled her close, kissed her forehead. They're not going to get violent. They want to play cops, remember? They'll strut, they'll shout, but the second they realize what they've stepped into, they'll crumble. She didn't look convinced, but she trusted me. And deep down, I trusted the training that had carried me through situations far worse than a power-hungry HOA president. The waiting was the hardest part. Every day felt like the air just before a storm, still heavy, ready to snap. Karen strutted around the neighborhood, whispering to anyone who would listen. Her enforcers made a show of patrolling radios, hissing static as they circled my property. I almost admired her persistence. Almost. And then finally, the moment came. A notice appeared on my door. Final enforcement action, immediate entry authorized. The wording was bold, official-looking, and laughably meaningless. But I smiled when I read it, because I knew what it really meant. They were about to make their move. That night, I sat in my study phone on the desk cameras streaming to my laptop. The house was quiet, Marlene already in bed. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows across the driveway. And then I heard it, the crunch of footsteps, the murmur of voices trying to sound tough. Through the monitor, I watched them gather at the edge of my garage, Karen's 2 officers, bolt cutters in hand, radios squawking nonsense. Karen herself sat in her car across the street, clipboard glowing in the dim light. They thought they were about to uncover my great crime. But the only thing they were about to uncover was the biggest mistake of their lives. The night they chose to make their move was humid, the kind of thick air that sticks to your skin. Perfect weather for trouble. I sat in my study with the cameras pulled up on my laptop, volume turned low so I could hear every scrape and whisper outside. And there they were, Karen's enforcers, standing like bargain bin stormtroopers at the edge of my garage. One carried the bolt cutters, the other clutched a flashlight like it was a weapon. Across the street, Karen sat in her car, windows down, clipboard balanced on her lap, her face glowing smug in the streetlight. "Do it," she hissed, barely audible on the mic I'd placed outside. Snap! The padlock gave way. The garage door rattled, then lifted with a groan. My heart didn't even race. I'd been waiting for this moment. The 2 men swaggered inside, flashlights darting across the walls. For a second, I wondered if they expected to find barrels of toxic waste or crates of contraband. But the instant their beams landed on the shelves, the bravado evaporated. There it was, my neatly arranged wall of tactical gear, my old bureau field files, the cases I'd been cleared to keep as training examples, and above it all, glinting in the light rows of authentic FBI badges and identification. The taller one froze mid-step. His mouth hung open. Mike. The other swallowed, hard voice cracking. Those are real. Their flashlights trembled in their hands as the weight of what they'd done hit them. They hadn't just broken into a garage. They'd broken into federal territory. That was my cue. I stepped out from the shadows of the driveway, calm, steady, every bit of me radiating the authority they'd just mocked. "Evening, gentlemen," I said, voice sharp enough to cut through the thick night air. They spun around, eyes wide. One dropped the flashlight, which clattered across the concrete. "You know what the penalty is for breaking and entering, don't you?" I asked, folding my arms. "Especially when the property belongs to a federal agent." Their faces drained of color. One stammered, We were authorized." I held up a finger. "Authorized by who, Karen?" I jerked my chin toward the car across the street. "Funny thing about HOA bylaws, they don't supersede federal law. Not even close." As if on cue, headlights flooded the street. Black SUVs rolled up doors, swinging open in practiced unison. Real agents, my old colleagues, stepped out, vests, strapped tight, badges gleaming under the floodlights. The wannabe cops looked like deer in headlights. Karen scrambled out of her car, arms flailing. "This is a mistake. I was protecting the community." One of the agents approached her, holding up a real badge inches from her face. "Ma'am, you and your board just committed criminal trespass and breaking and entering. We'll need you to step aside." I wish I could describe the look on her face, her confidence shattering like glass, her mouth opening and closing without a word coming out. For months, she'd strutted around like a queen. In that moment, she was nothing but a thief caught red-handed. Neighbors began pouring out of their houses, drawn by the flashing lights and raised voices. They gathered on sidewalks, whispering, pointing. Some gasped when they saw the FBI jackets. Others looked at me with wide eyes as if seeing me for the first time. Karen tried one last desperate swing. "He's hiding something. You don't understand. He's dangerous." I stepped forward, calm as ever. "The only danger here is you, Karen. You trespassed. You harassed. You abused your position. And now everyone knows exactly who you are." Silence. Thick, heavy silence, broken only by the sound of handcuffs clicking around her enforcer's wrists. Karen wasn't arrested that night. Federal law tends to move slower with paperwork and process, but the humiliation was immediate. She stood there trembling, cornered, every neighbor's eye burning holes into her as the truth sank in. The agents didn't need me to say much. The cameras had caught everything. The break-in, the trespassing, the flyers, the misuse of HOA funds, it was all laid out neatly. My old friends gave me a nod, one that said, "We've got it from here." I turned to the crowd of neighbors, voice steady, carrying across the street. "For months I've been accused, slandered, and harassed. Tonight you all saw the truth. This wasn't about safety. It wasn't about rules. It was about power. And when people abuse power, this is what happens." Karen tried to speak, but the words died on her lips. The neighborhood had seen enough. As the agents escorted her cops away, the murmurs began. Disbelief, relief, a touch of shame from those who had believed her lies. I didn't gloat, didn't smile. I just stood there calm and collected, letting the moment sink in, because this wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. And justice finally had arrived on my driveway. And for the first time in months, the night felt quiet again. The morning after the showdown, the neighborhood looked different. Not the houses, they were the same, cookie-cutter homes with trimmed hedges and identical mailboxes. No, what changed was the air. It felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off everyone's shoulders. For months, Karen had ruled with fear, clipboard in hand, weaponizing her title against anyone who dared defy her. But once the FBI SUVs rolled in, her empire crumbled overnight. The fallout came fast. First, the board. Without Karen's grip, the other members scattered like leaves in the wind. One resigned immediately, citing personal stress. Another vanished, avoiding questions from neighbors and reporters alike. The treasurer, remember, the one who signed off on the $3,200 security expenses. He was called in for questioning and quietly stepped down before anyone could vote him out. Then came the community's reckoning. At the next HOA meeting, which was packed to the rafters, residents voted unanimously to dissolve Karen's so-called enforcement squad. The decals were stripped off the SUV, the radios boxed up the polos, tossed into a donation bin. For the first time, people spoke freely, without fear of being cited for crooked blinds or untrimmed shrubs. Karen herself, she didn't show. Word spread that she was facing charges, trespassing, harassment, even misuse of HOA funds. I didn't have to dig. The feds were already handling it. All I knew was that she went from queen bee to social outcast in less than 24 hours. I should have felt triumphant, vindicated, maybe even smug. But mostly I just felt tired. Tired of the nonsense, the games, the way one person's hunger for control had poisoned an entire street. One evening, Tom, the neighbor who'd once whispered his doubts at a meeting, came by with a six-pack. He handed me a bottle, his voice sheepish. "Danny, I owe you an apology. I let her scare me. I didn't speak up when I should have." I clinked my bottle against his. "You're not the only one, Tom. Fear makes people quiet. That's how bullies win." He nodded, relief washing over his face. "Not anymore. Not here." The weeks rolled on, and little by little normal life returned. No more flyers, no more pounding at midnight. My mailbox stayed upright. The word danger was scrubbed from my driveway, replaced by chalk drawings from neighborhood kids. And for the first time since we moved in, Marlene and I could sit on our porch in peace, sipping coffee, watching the sunset without glancing over our shoulders. Neighbors started waving again, some even stopping to chat. A few admitted they'd believed Karen's lies at first, but seeing her exposed reminded them to trust actions, not rumors. Funny thing about fear, it spreads fast, but truth spreads faster once the dam breaks. As for me, I didn't hang up my past on a nail in the garage, not completely. My career may be behind me, but the instincts remain. And in this case, those instincts saved me, and in a way saved the neighborhood too. The Karen file, I kept it. Thick folder, neatly organized, every scrap of evidence tucked inside. Not because I needed it anymore, but because it reminded me of something important. Bullies never think they're the bad guy. They convince themselves they're righteous, justified, chosen, and that's why they're dangerous. But in the end, the truth has a way of cracking through the bravado. Karen thought she could play cop. She thought her fake badges and flyers would scare me into submission. She thought she held the power. But she forgot the most important rule of all: when you misuse power, eventually power bites back. And when it didn't just nip her heels, it swallowed her whole. Looking back, I realized this story wasn't just about me or my garage. It was about what happens when ordinary people forget that respect, not control, is what keeps a community together. Karen's reign of intimidation thrived because so many stayed silent. And I don't blame them, fear is a heavy thing. But silence gives bullies oxygen. When truth finally came to light, it wasn't just my fight that ended, it was everyone's chains breaking at once. That's the lesson I carry with me. Never let someone's hunger for control dictate your peace. Stand your ground even when it's uncomfortable. Because sometimes the quiet resistance of one person is enough to tip the scales for everyone. So I'll leave you with this: if you've ever faced your own HOA, Karen, tell your story. Share it in the comments below. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button, because you never know when the next tale of justice, drama, and karma will hit home.